Viewer discretion advised. This is a dramatized narrative, inspired by true events. Some sections are entirely fictional. November 17th, 1993. Sony Music Studios, New York City. The day before MTV Unplugged would be filmed. Kurt Cobain insisted on a private rehearsal. Only 5 were in the room. The sound engineer, 2 guitar techs, and Krist Novoselic and Dave Grohl watching from the shadows. For 90 minutes, Kurt ran through the setlist, adjusting, reworking, perfecting. But when he reached the lead belly cover that would become his most haunting performance, something happened that made everyone in that room go silent. At the 2:34 mark of the rehearsal tape, Kurt stopped playing, and in the silence, he said 7 words that the sound engineer later described as the most chilling thing I've ever heard. Dave Grohl would later say those 7 words explained everything about the next 4 months. The rehearsal tape sat in MTV's archives for 15 years before a producer digitizing old recordings heard what Kurt whispered. When asked about it in 2008, the producer said, "I understood immediately why they never released this version. It wasn't a rehearsal. It was a goodbye. It was a gray November afternoon in Manhattan, the kind where the sky hangs low and heavy, threatening rain that never quite comes." Kurt Cobain arrived at Sony Music Studios at 2:07 p.m., 43 minutes late, carrying his Martin D18E acoustic guitar in a battered case covered with stickers from dive bars and punk venues. Alex Coletti, MTV Unplugged's veteran producer, met him in the corridor outside Studio 313. Coletti had produced dozens of Unplugged sessions, Eric Clapton, Gal Jam, 10,000 Maniacs, but he'd never had an artist request a full private rehearsal the day before taping. "You sure you need the whole afternoon?" Coletti asked. "We can do a quick sound check tomorrow morning instead." Kurt shook his head, his blonde hair falling across his face. "I need to feel the room alone first. No cameras, no audience, just me and the songs." Something in Kurt's voice made Coletti agree, without further questions. There was a heaviness there, a weight that went beyond typical pre-show nerves. Coletti had been doing this job long enough recognize when an artist was carrying something dark. "I'll have the sound engineer record it for technical reference," Coletti said. "Standard protocol. You won't even notice he's there." Kurt nodded and pushed open the studio door. Studio 313 was smaller than most people imagined when they watched the final Unplugged broadcast. The stage area was intimate, surrounded by candles and lilies that the MTV art department had already set up. At the next day's taping, the flowers gave the space an almost funeral atmosphere. Brian Vig, the sound engineer, was already positioned at the mixing board, running final checks on the microphone array. 2 guitar techs, Danny and Mike, were setting up equipment near the stage area, and in the back row of chairs, barely visible in the dim studio lighting, sat Krist Novoselic and Dave Grohl. Kurt hadn't asked his bandmates to come to the rehearsal, but they'd shown up anyway. They knew Kurt had been struggling with fame, with his stomach pain, with the pressure of being called the voice of a generation when all he'd ever wanted was to make music in a basement with his friends. "You good?" Krist called out from the shadows. Kurt lifted one hand in acknowledgement, but didn't answer. He walked to the center of the stage area, set down his guitar case, and stood for a long moment, just looking at the space. The candles flickered. The lilies seemed to watch him. The Though studio felt like it was holding its breath. Danny, one of the guitar techs, approached with Kurt's Fender Mustang for the electric portions of the set, but Kurt waved him off. "Just the Martin today," Kurt said quietly. "I want to run everything acoustic. The way it'll be tomorrow." For the next 90 minutes, Kurt methodically worked through the set list he and the band had carefully constructed. The set list was unusual for an Unplugged performance, heavy on covers, light on Nirvana hits. Kurt had insisted on including 3 Meat Puppets songs, the Vaseline's cover, and several deep cuts that even hardcore Nirvana fans might not recognize. He started with About a Girl, his fingers finding the chords with practiced ease. His voice was rough, unpracticed, but there was something raw and honest in the imperfection. He stopped halfway through the second verse, adjusted the capo, and started again. Brian Vig, at the mixing board, watched the VU meters dance and made notes about microphone placement. He'd been engineering live recordings for 15 years, and he prided himself on capturing not just the sound, but the feeling of a performance. And what he was feeling from Kurt Cobain that afternoon was something he'd never quite encountered before. It wasn't nervousness or uncertainty. It was more like watching someone say goodbye. Kurt moved through Come As You Are, adjusting his vocal approach, making it softer, more vulnerable than the electric version everyone knew. He ran through Jesus. Doesn't want me for a Sunday. His voice barely above a whisper on certain lines. Krist and Dave sat motionless in the back of the studio, not speaking, barely moving. They'd known Kurt since high school, had watched him transform from a shy, angry kid from Aberdeen into the reluctant icon now standing under studio lights. They'd seen him in every mood, euphoric, depressed, energetic, catatonic. But this version of Kurt, this afternoon in Studio 313, was different. This Kurt seemed to be cataloging something, preserving something, making sure every note was exactly right, not for the audience tomorrow, but for something else entirely. At 4:15 p.m., Kurt reached the end of the planned setlist. He'd run through all 14 songs, making small adjustments, changing tempos, reworking vocal approaches. The final song on the list was the lead belly cover, the murder ballad that Kurt had insisted on including, despite concerns from MTV that it might be too dark, too raw, too unsettling for the unplugged format. Kurt stood at the microphone for a full minute without playing, without speaking. The studio was silent except for the faint hum of electronics and the occasional shuffle of feet. Then he began to play. The opening chords were delicate, almost fragile. Kurt's fingers moved across the strings with a tenderness that seemed at odds with the violence of the song's lyrics. His voice, when it came in, was barely audible at first. Brian Vig leaned forward at the mixing board, adjusting levels, capturing every breath, every subtle shift in tone. Kurt sang through the first verse with his eyes closed. The words told the story of a man asking a woman where she slept last night, a simple question that carried the weight of betrayal, jealousy, and violence. It was a song about possession and loss, about the terrible things people do when they can't let go. Dave Grohl would later say that watching Kurt sing that song in rehearsal was like watching someone's soul come apart and reassemble itself in real time. The second verse came, darker and more intense. Kurt's voice grew stronger, more urgent. The guitar work became more aggressive, the chords hitting harder. This was the part where the murder ballad revealed its true nature, not a love song, but a confession, a warning, a prophecy. Then Kurt reached the bridge, and something changed. At the 2:34 mark of the rehearsal recording, Kurt stopped playing. Not a natural pause, not a planned break. He just stopped, his hands going still on the guitar strings, creating a sudden silence that felt like a physical presence in the room. Brian Vig's hand froze over the mixing board. Danny and Mike, the guitar techs, looked up from their equipment. Krist sat forward in his chair. Dave held his breath. Kurt stood at the microphone with his head bowed, his blonde hair covering his face. For 15 seconds, nobody moved. The candles flickered. The lilies seemed to lean in, listening. And then Kurt whispered 7 words into the microphone. 7 words that Brian Vig's recording equipment captured with perfect clarity. 7 words that would remain buried in MTV's archives for 15 years. 7 words that Dave Grohl would later say explained everything about the 4 months that followed. Kurt whispered, "This is the last time I'll sing." The sound engineer's blood went cold. Danny, the guitar tech, would later tell friends that the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Krist Novoselic ripped the arms of his chair so hard his knuckles went white. But Kurt wasn't done. After those 7 words, he stood silent for another moment, then added in a voice barely above a breath, "I can feel it leaving me, the music, the part of me that wants to be here. It's going away and I can't stop it." Dave Grohl started to stand, started to move toward his friend, but Krist put a hand on his arm, holding him back. They both understood instinctively that this moment needed to happen. that Kurt needed to say whatever he was going to say without interruption. Kurt lifted his head, his eyes open now, staring at something beyond the studio walls, beyond the city, beyond anything the people in that room could see. Tomorrow I'll perform this song, and everyone will think it's about murder or jealousy or betrayal, Kurt said, his voice growing stronger, more clear, more terrifyingly calm. But it's not about any of that. It's about knowing you're supposed to feel something, and discovering you can't feel anything at all anymore. He touched his chest, right above his heart. It's about being empty, being hollow, being a ghost while you're still alive. Brian Vig at the mixing board felt tears running down his face and didn't know why. He'd recorded hundreds of sessions, thousands of performances, but he'd never heard anyone speak with such complete, devastating honesty. Kurt looked directly at the shadows where Krist and Dave were sitting. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I'm sorry I'm not who you thought I was. I'm sorry I can't be the person everyone needs me to be. I'm sorry that tomorrow I'll stand on this stage and pretend one more time." Dave Grohl would later say that in that moment, he understood that his best friend was already gone. Not dead, but departed in some essential way. The Kurt Cobain that the world knew, that Nirvana depended on, that millions of fans worshipped. That person had left the building, and what remained was someone going through the motions, playing a role, fulfilling obligations until he couldn't anymore. Kurt picked up his guitar and continued the song. But everything was different now. The words that had seemed like a murder ballad now sounded like a suicide note. The chorus that spoke of shivering in the cold now felt like a description of emotional hypothermia. Every note was a goodbye. When Kurt reached the final verse, his voice broke. Not from emotion, but from something beyond emotion. It was the sound of a person who had moved past feeling, past caring, past the ability to pretend that anything mattered anymore. The song ended with Kurt sustaining the final note longer than seemed humanly possible, his voice cracking and straining and finally breaking into a raw, primal sound that was half music, half agony. Then silence. Kurt set down his guitar with careful precision, as if it were made of glass. He stood at the microphone for a moment, not looking at anyone, not speaking. Finally, he said in a normal, almost casual voice, "That'll work for tomorrow. Thanks for recording it, Brian. Make sure to delete this tape, though. Use tomorrow's performance for the broadcast." Brian Vig, still shaken, could only nod. Kurt walked off the stage area, picked up his guitar case, and headed for the door. As he passed Krist and Dave in the back row, he stopped briefly. "See you tomorrow, guys," he said. And then, so quietly they almost didn't hear it, "Probably." The door closed behind him. For a full minute, nobody in Studio 313 spoke. The candles continued to flicker. The lilies stood watch. The microphones hummed with the memory of what they'd captured. Finally, Dave Grohl stood up, his legs unsteady. He looked at Krist. "We need to do something," Dave said. "We need to help him." Krist's face was pale. "I don't think we can. I think he's already made his decision." The next day, November 18th, 1993, Kurt Cobain walked onto the same stage, in Studio 313, and delivered one of the most powerful performances in MTV Unplugged history. He sang the lead belly cover with intensity and passion. He made eye contact with the audience. He smiled occasionally. He was, by all accounts, present and engaged. The performance that was broadcast to millions showed an artist at the height of his powers, raw and vulnerable but very much alive, very much in the moment. But the 5 people who had been in the studio the day before knew the truth. They'd heard what Kurt said in the rehearsal. They'd witnessed the real goodbye. Brian Vig labeled the rehearsal tape November 17 Technical Run-Through and filed it away in MTV's archive system. He never mentioned to anyone what Kurt had whispered during that rehearsal. Some things he believed were too private, too sacred to share. The tape sat untouched for 15 years. In 2008, MTV began a massive digitization project, converting decades of archived analog recordings to digital formats. A young producer named Sarah Chen was assigned to work through boxes of old unplugged session tapes. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, she loaded the reel labeled Kurt Cobain November 17 technical run-through into the playback machine and put on her headphones. For 90 minutes, she listened to Kurt work through the setlist. It was fascinating from a historical perspective, hearing the raw, unpolished versions of songs that would become iconic. Then she reached the 2:34 mark of the lead belly cover. Sarah heard Kurt stop playing. She heard the silence. And then she heard the whisper that made her hands go cold. "This is the last time I'll sing." She immediately called her supervisor and played him the recording. They sat together, listening to Kurt's confession, his apology, his goodbye. "Why didn't anyone do anything?" Sarah asked, tears in her eyes. He was clearly saying he was going to kill himself. Why didn't they stop him? Her supervisor, who had been working at MTV since the early 90s, shook his head sadly. "You have to understand the context. Artists say dramatic things all the time." Kurt was known for being dark and depressive in his lyrics. At the time, people probably thought he was just being poetic, being Kurt. Nobody understood it was literal. But 5 months later, he was dead, Sarah said. 5 months later, he was dead, her supervisor confirmed. They made the decision not to release the rehearsal tape publicly. It felt like a violation, like publishing someone's suicide note without permission. The recording remained in MTV's archives, accessible only to a few executives who were told about its existence. But word spread, as secrets always do in the music industry. In 2010, a music journalist named Marcus Webb was researching a book about Nirvana and heard rumors about the rehearsal tape from a former MTV employee. He spent 2 years trying to get access to the recording, filing Freedom of Information requests, arguing that it was historically significant. MTV refused every request. In 2012, Marcus finally tracked down Brian Vig, the sound engineer who had recorded the rehearsal. They met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn on a cold February morning. Brian was 63 years old then, retired from music engineering, working as a sound design consultant for film. He'd recorded thousands of sessions in his career, worked with hundreds of legendary artists, but the Kurt Cobain rehearsal still haunted him. "I think about it every time I hear that song," Brian told Marcus. "Every time someone plays the official MTV Unplugged version, I hear the rehearsal underneath it. I hear what Kurt said when he thought nobody was really listening." "What do you think he meant?" Marcus asked. When he said it was the last time he'd sing, Brian stirred his coffee for a long time before answering. "I think Kurt knew on some level that he was leaving. Not necessarily that he'd be dead in 5 months, but that the person he was, the artist, the performer, the Kurt Cobain that the world needed, that person was dying, and he was giving that person a proper burial, a proper farewell performance." "Do you think he was planning suicide even then?" Marcus pressed. Brian shook his head. "I don't know. I've thought about it 1,000 times, and I still don't know, but I think he knew he couldn't keep being what everyone expected him to be. The pressure, the fame, the pain, it was killing him slowly. And that afternoon in the studio, he was acknowledging it, naming it, saying goodbye to the part of himself that could still perform, could still create, could still care." Marcus's book, The Last Performance, Kurt Cobain's Final Year, was published in 2013. He included a chapter about the rehearsal tape, based on Brian Vig's interview, and accounts the 2 guitar techs who had been present that day. Danny, one of the guitar techs, shared his memory. "When Kurt stopped playing and started talking, it felt like the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. It wasn't that what he said was shocking. Kurt said dark stuff all the time. It was the way he said it, calm, accepting, like he was reading a weather report about his own death." Mike, the other tech, added, "After Kurt left, we all just stood there. Nobody knew what to do. Do you call someone? Tell someone? But who do you tell? And what do you say? Hey, Kurt Cobain seems really depressed. Everyone already knew that. He might hurt himself." That seemed like an overreaction based on some whispered comments during a rehearsal, so we did nothing. And I've carried that guilt for 20 years. Dave Grohl refused to be interviewed for Marcus's book, but years later, In a 2016 documentary about Nirvana, he spoke briefly about the rehearsal. "That afternoon was when I knew," Dave said, his eyes distant. "Not that Kurt was gonna die, but that we were losing him. He was standing right there in front of us, but he wasn't present. He was already somewhere else, somewhere we couldn't reach." And the hardest part is knowing that even if we'd said something, even if we tried to help, I don't think we could have changed anything. When someone decides they're done, really done, there's no argument that can change their mind. Krist Novoselic has never publicly discussed the rehearsal. When asked about it in interviews, he simply says, "Some moments are too personal to share," and changes the subject. But in 2019, during a podcast interview, Krist did say something that gave insight into that November afternoon. Kurt was really a goodbye artist. Everything he did, especially toward the end, had this quality of farewell to it. The Unplugged performance wasn't just a concert. It was a way of leaving something permanent, something that would exist after he was gone. He knew, I think, that his time was limited, whether by his own hand or by the pain and addiction that was destroying him. So he made sure to create something beautiful as his final statement. The MTV Unplugged performance that aired on December 14, 1993, became one of the most celebrated live recordings in rock history. Kurt's performance of the Lead Belly Murder Ballad became the iconic closing moment, a haunting finale that seemed to capture everything about Nirvana's raw, emotional honesty. 5 months later, on April 5, 1994, Kurt Cobain died in the greenhouse above his Seattle garage. The cause of death was officially ruled as suicide by shotgun. But the 5 people who were in Studio 313 on November 17, 1993, have always believed that Kurt's real goodbye happened that afternoon during the private rehearsal, when he whispered 7 words into a microphone and then sang like a man who knew he'd never sing again. The rehearsal tape still exists in MTV's digital archives, digitized but never released. Every few years, someone requests access for a documentary or book or anniversary special. Every time MTV denies the request. Some documents they believe are too intimate, too raw, too honest to share with the world. Some farewells are meant to be private, but for the people who heard Kurt's whisper that day, those 7 words, "This is the last time I'll sing," became a haunting prophecy that explained everything that came after. Not because Kurt necessarily knew he would die 5 months later, but because he understood what was already dying inside him: the will to continue, the ability to feel, the desire to be present in a life that had become unbearable. The MTV Unplugged performance that the world knows is powerful and moving and tragic in retrospect. But the rehearsal that nobody has heard is something else entirely. It's the sound of a human being naming their own ending, acknowledging their own limits, and saying goodbye while everyone was still listening. If this story about Kurt Cobain's final rehearsal moved you, consider what it means when artists tell us they're struggling. The warning signs aren't always obvious. Sometimes they're whispered into microphones during rehearsals that only 5 people witness. Kurt Cobain's legacy isn't just his music. It's also a reminder that behind every performance, every smile, every public appearance, there might be someone who's barely holding on. Someone who's already said their private goodbye, even as they continue to go through the motions for the world. The rehearsal tape is a document of that moment, when the artist and the person separate, when the performance becomes a mask, when someone stands on a stage and says, "This is the last time," and means it in ways nobody fully understands until it's too late. 29 years later, that November afternoon in Studio 313 remains one of the most haunting what-if moments in music history. What if someone had taken Kurt's words literally? What if someone had called a therapist, a crisis counselor, his mother? What if someone had said, "We're not doing the show tomorrow, we're getting you help today"? Would it have changed anything? The people who were there don't think so. They believe Kurt had already made his decision, not necessarily to die, but to stop pretending, to stop performing, to stop being the person everyone needed him to be. And in that sense, the whispered confession during the rehearsal wasn't a cry for help. It was simply the truth, spoken aloud one last time before the mask went back on for the final performance. The world knows Kurt Cobain through his music, his lyrics, his iconic performances. But 5 people know him through 7 whispered words in an empty studio, a moment of brutal honesty that was never meant to be shared. That's the recording that haunts them. That's the moment they can't forget. Not the legendary MTV Unplugged performance that millions have watched, but the private rehearsal where Kurt Cobain stopped pretending and told the truth. This is the last time. And then, like a professional, like the artist he was, until the very end, he picked up his guitar and finished the song.